it was a disgrace to him. And I'll have
The way you describe it is more of a personal loss.
Right.
As one would be frustrated and upset always if you lost a limb or something. You would never rest if there was a way to get that back.
Right, or in a very same way of, I mean, looking at a daughter or a son who, let's say, becomes a meth addict or something, But there is something, a part of you that sort of makes you want to go and help your own flesh and blood. But literally, I mean, it's almost as if we're God's flesh and blood, because we have his nefesh, we have his breath, his spirit. And so the point in Genesis, though, in those first chapters in Genesis, is that our ontology is tied up in God. And it's also tied up in the universe. And we'll talk a little bit about that when we get into the fall. However, in the Western world, salvation is often talked about as a resolution to a legalistic dilemma. That you have a perfect God. And this perfect God has set these boundaries. Right? He set the boundaries, and man disobeyed it. So now man has transgressed against God's law. And so now God needs to be appeased. And he needs a perfect sacrifice in order to appease him.
So the problem is God's anger.
That you're right, is God's anger, is trying to cure God's wrath, so to speak. And so the only thing that he can do is send himself to die to appease himself. That's not how the Orthodox Church sees salvation. I mean, there is some legalistic language, especially in the Old Testament, especially in Paul. But holistically, salvation is not a result to a legalistic dilemma.
But historically speaking, that idea doesn't really take form until Anselm in the 11th century. Mm-hmm. So Christianity did without that idea for 1,000 years.
Well, and a lot of Orthodox theologians, and especially Romanides, and I wanted to bring that book today. I had it in a package because I lost my copy and I had to buy a new one because it's such a great book. It's The Ancestral Sin by Romanides. And Romanides, Father Romanides said that really salvation, the way that it's looked at in the Gospels and the way that it's looked at in Orthodoxy, is that it's a healing process. In that it's not just Anselm who talks about this, but really when you go back to Augustine sort of sows the seeds for this.
This is why Augustine is not a saint to us.
Depends who you ask.
Depends who you ask.
Well, I've been told that.
Some people look at him as a saint, some people do not. Some people call him the Blessed Augustine.
That's what I've heard.
Augustine got a lot of things right, but a lot of what, and I think what Romanides says, and Romanides I think is sometimes isn't too charitable, but that it's usually a condition of Western thinking, and just the atmosphere of the West is that salvation is not a result to a legalistic dilemma. Instead, salvation is a healing process. It's healing for us. And that sin, our sinful nature, is really a malady of our fallen condition. Just as, I'm trying to think, like with cancer, just as with a compromised immune system is a symptom of cancer. A symptom of our malady, a symptom of our fall is sin. And this is one of the reasons why we baptize infants. Not that the infant has committed any type of sin yet, but baptism brings them into the church, it is unto the remission of sins, and so they participate through their baptism in the burial and resurrection of Christ, and they're given communion, which, as I tell parents who are kind of reluctant about baptizing their children and giving them communion, I say, do you inoculate your kids with from measles, mumps, rubella, whatever it is, polio? Do you give them vaccines? And they say, yes, of course. I say, well, then why don't you give them communion? Because communion is sort of a vaccine. It vaccinates them from sin and death. This is why when we commune someone, it's what? It's unto the forgiveness of sins. Communion offers the forgiveness of sins, just as any sacrament in the church bestows the forgiveness of sins.
Well,
Okay?
what exactly then is the status of not sin but sins, individual misdeeds?
Individual misdeeds.
When we commit a misdeed, that's a symptom of our condition. Is that the Western view, that would be a transgression against God's law, which would then be deserving
Of divine
of
punishment.
punishment. However, there is the solution of Christ and the forgiveness of sins in the Western Church. What would we say in parallel to that? That individual misdeed is what?
It's a symptom of that individual's fallen condition.
Okay.
That's what we would say. I mean, you can sort of see this in children as they get older. And this is a lot of, a question that is given to me a lot by parents is, when should I have my kids go to confession? Which I think is a really
That's a good
important
question.
So, in the Western Church, the Catholic Church, I remember going to confession when I was around 6 or 7. In the Orthodox Church, we don't have this concept of an age of accountability. Because a lot of that implies sort of Gnosticism. Mm-hmm. That you have to be in the know to be saved. But you sort of see this with children, with them becoming, selfish and sort of assert. I mean, I'm sort of seeing it with my daughter now. That even at the tender age of 20 months, she's starting to be flippant and disobeying her parents. That's sort of a symptom of fallen nature. Where we sort of, I would say that, it's sort of, it's kind of weird because, we were talking about kids and child psychology and things like that, but, you sort of see it with children. And
Well, you're talking about 20 months, the terrible twos
have
a reputation for this.
Right, and so we would say that the individual's misdeeds were not, people don't come to confession in order to appease God's wrath. And we talk about that in our prayers that God would be merciful to us and that we are deserving of wrath. But I don't think that good parents act that way.
So God would be distressed, as we would be distressed for a symptom of illness in our children.
In our own children. So I would say that when someone comes to confession, like let's say lust, okay? Like someone who has come to me and they've confessed that they've had an affair or something, or they've confessed that they're angry with someone, or they want to literally wring someone's neck. I would say that that's a malady that needs to be treated. St. John Chrysostom said that the church is a hospital for sinners. And that we're all sinners. I mean, even right down to the priest, right down to the bishop. And that we're all here in order to be treated, to receive the cure for our souls, which is the mysteries of the church. So that's how we would interpret that. Did you have a question?
trying to think of how to phrase it. It's when we have our individual sins, or it does seem like we are transgressing against God in
Yes.
some way. There are certain precepts, laws, statutes that you don't do. The Ten Commandments are a very clear example.
For our guidance.
Right.
For our guidance, yeah, exactly. But when we do that, when we act in anger, when someone commits murder or steals, they really are transgressing in some way, in that when we enter into confession, we seek forgiveness for those particular actions.
Right.
It's not, and it seems like there's that aspect of it, and through participating in the church in that way, we're going through the process of healing, and that's kind of where the image of the hospital comes in.
Is this a parallel? When you go to the doctor, you tell him your symptoms.
Correct.
I mean, is that a valid parallel?
And I think it's a valid
I
parallel.
think there's more than that, though, because I think it's not just the speech of telling the doctor your symptoms, it's showing the doctor your wound,
Right.
and the doctor taking that wound away.
Right.
And then also, and also revealing the cause and seeking to alleviate yourself from a cause of having that wound further inflicted upon yourself. But I think there is that wound that needs to be taken away through that act of
Yeah, well, you
confession,
don't
if that
just
makes
tell
sense.
the doctor your symptoms and go home.
Yes, yeah, exactly.
He's going to do something
He's
as a
going to
result
treat
of
it.
that.
And I think that I think it's important to realize that when someone comes to me in confession, I normally don't, and the Orthodox Church doesn't do this, but the Catholic Church does when they break sins into mortal and venial. Our sins are very, very specific. And I think it's important to realize that, because a lot of people will come, and just being a priest since 2011, I've noticed that a lot of people, if they come to me for confession regularly, I notice they tend to confess the same things over and over again.
Oh, yes.
And I think we all sort of struggle with individual sins. I think the evil one knows where to prick us. And, just as someone may have issues with, someone may have a heart condition, someone may have problems with diabetes, someone may have problems with things like that. And these are maladies that need to be cured. These are illnesses that need to be treated. It's not, there is juridical language, but I think holistically it's looking at a person as someone who needs to be treated.
The juridical language probably has a purpose. I'm just trying to think. Maybe the purpose of looking at it from a judgment point of view is not for God to look at it that way, but for us to look at it ourselves that way. To have or is this right? I'm still struggling in the transition from west to east. Do I apply judgment to myself and say, okay, I have done wrong? I would assume that has to happen at some level in order for me to make a confession of a specific act, that I have to have reached the judgment that this act is wrong before I would include it in my confession. So perhaps I'm just feeling my way here, that perhaps the judgment aspect of things has to be applied by us to us.
You going to add something?
Yeah, it seems like there's, along with the juridical view of it, there's action and consequence. And ultimately the story is that, again, going back to Adam and Eve, we transgressed, we acted, we transgressed, and the consequence was death. And death is a really interesting point to look at in this, because there's no the relieving of death is not like the process of theosis. It's the relieving of death is that immediate salvation that we have in Christ, and that's something which seems a bit more. It seems like that is more an image of judgment, because that is upon us. We're subject to death, and then in Christ we're freed from that. And again, it's not something that we did, and it's not something that we're coming to do. It's something that's been given to us. It's something that we brought on ourselves because of our transgressions, and God in His sacrifice relieved us of that. The consequence, which is death, ultimately.
I'm struggling to remember some things that Father Philip said. It seems that he said something about death was more an inevitable consequence than a punishment assigned.
Well,
in other words, a judge made crime. It's not like that. It's more like
You drop the hammer and it hit your foot.
you drop the hammer and it hits your foot.
Right.
Yeah.
The consequence.
It's a consequence of, I look at it this way. There's a book by Zazoulis, John Zazoulis, called Being is Communion, which talks about how it's communion with God, how we find, it's mostly on ontology, which is what I'm kind of talking about. I was talking about a while ago, but he talks about how, and Schmemann also talks about this, that what does God say to Adam and Eve if they eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil? What's going to happen?
They'll die.
You'll die.
Mhm.
And that's a result of their separation from God. Because where did they get their immortality from?
From God.
They got it from God. And in fact, and we'll talk about this in a minute, or we'll talk about this right now, with the fall of man, because man was tied in with the universe so intricately, because man, in a way, God made him as a microcosm of the universe. When man falls, what it ends up doing is it causes everything to die. I mean,
There's no mention that the animals are going to die.
there's no
before
mention
the
that the
fall
animals die before the fall either. So when Adam and Eve separate themselves from God, the universe literally starts rotting.
The creation is separated from God.
Right. Because what, and this goes back to Homo homins. Why did God create man? Why did God create man?
Well, the
I'm throwing
answer
that
I was
out.
originally taught was essentially for
Entertainment?
companionship, for to have someone to love.
To have someone to love. Okay. Anything else?
Well, in Genesis it says created man to tend the garden.
To tend the garden. Right. To tend the garden. Okay? That's the first reason. Okay? And really, if we think of someone who tends a garden, okay? Someone who's sort of a caretaker, okay? There's an early interpretation of caretakers being like, or priests being like caretakers. Man, and I'll throw this out to everybody, man was created by God to be the priest of creation. That's why man was created. God wanted something to love, yes, but there's also that aspect of tending the garden. And what did this tending of the garden imply? Well, what he was supposed to do is man was supposed to take creation, care for it, offer it up back to God, and then God would sanctify it, and then give it back to man. And that there would be this reciprocal relationship that would continue all throughout eternity. And in fact, that's what we do here in the church, right? Why can't we take wheat and grapes and just use that for communion?
Because it's not something that
It's
man
not something
is.
that man has made. Show me another animal that can make bread. I mean, we can teach robots probably how to make bread. But someone needs to program those
Right.
robots.
But we would have made the robots which made the bread. So
Right.
Just like we made the bowl that you stirred and the spoon that you stirred
Correct.
the flour with.
So show me another animal on this planet that can make wine. Only humans can. Only humans have that knowledge of fermentation. And so what God has done in communion is sort of that, it has that aspect of that primal aspect of what man was supposed to do, because God provides us with the wheat, He provides us with the grapes. We take that, make it into bread, make it into wine, and we offer it back to God. And what does God do with it? He gives us His Son. And that's sort of that's a symbol of that, not a symbol, but it's a representation. It's an incarnation of that reciprocal relationship that God had with man. And so now with receiving communion, we go and we sanctify the world. Okay.
I was teaching Gothic cathedrals today, briefly, and I was talking about how they had symbols and creatures and things all over them. They tried to show all the different species of plants, all the different animals, all the crafts, everything, and that this was done even up in the spires where nobody would see it. And the point I was trying to get across was that this was an effort to create a micro-creation and offer it back to God. Mm-hmm. To me that seems like what you were describing as our purpose was to take the raw creation and transform it and offer it back to God.
And that this is one of the reasons why we call Christ the second Adam, because He did that which Adam could not do. Mm-hmm. That Christ really is truly, He is the high priest, because as being God and man, He consecrated Himself, offered Himself to His Father, and His Father gave Him back to us. There was a lovely fresco that I saw in the museum. I think it was at St. Mark's in Venice. And it was a fresco that was in the area where the dome, I don't know if you know of St. Mark's, but there's the dome where it has the creation of the world.
Right.
And this sort of looked like a figure eight. But I looked at the figure eight and it was actually an infinity symbol.
Yeah.
And this was a fresco that they had in the museum that used to be in the church, and it showed the creation of the world, ending with the creation of man in the garden. And then it looped it back, and it did, it was the life of Christ. And it ended right next to the creation of man with Mary Magdalene finding Christ in the garden and thinking He's the gardener. There's a reason why that in that gospel, Mary Magdalene thinks
He's the gardener.
He's the gardener. And finds Him in the garden because it harkens back to Adam. She mistook Him for the gardener.
He was in a sense the gardener.
He was in a sense the gardener, which is it's kind of funny. It's kind of a play on theology. But just looking at that figure eight, that infinity symbol, it really struck me. So with the fall of man, the goodness of all created things are emphasized, and the origin of evil does not lie in God, but it's in the free act of sin. It's in man's free will and the influence of the devil, of the evil one.
So we would say then that, or would we, that natural processes that, like hurricanes, that seem to play an integral role in the way the world works, would not have been dangerous or would not have worked that way had the creation remained as God made it.
I don't know, maybe.
Yeah, that's a speculation.
And we would ask in seminary about, what was life like before the fall, or would viruses be like this? And all we can know is what we've been given
Yeah.
right now. And
We don't even know how long it was.
right. You know, there's the old
لأني لست أقول سرك لآدم